Great. So it is my very great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Susan Waters. Before we do, there was a question in the chat, and I just wanted to clarify that Dr. Waters is speaking next week also, next Monday, April 15th, for the wider Native Plant Appreciation Month. And she'll be talking, I believe, new research on rare plants and their pollinators. So anyway, let me introduce Susan Waters. She is the senior ecologist at Squamish Eco Research in Olympia, Washington. Her recent research focuses on invasive bumblebees, pollination of rare plants, and how restoration restructures plant pollinator communities. She loves flowers, bees, flies, phenology, and just about any discussion of ecological ideas. Susan earned her doctorate at the University of Washington, where her research focused on native exotic plant interactions mediated by pollinators and the effects of phenological shifting of those interactions. She currently studies how prairie plant pollinator networks change as sites undergo restoration and as native plant populations rebound. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everybody for showing up. I'm delighted. And I'll go ahead and share my screen. And make us all small. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I saw a bunch of familiar names on the list there. I'm really excited to have so many people be interested in native plants and pollinators and our prairies that we love so much. My title here is slightly different from how it was advertised, and I hope that's okay. I'm going to plan to focus in a little bit more on prescribed fire and the effects of prescribed fire as a form of restoration. So I'm going to talk about plants, pollinators, prescribed fire, and prairie, what I'm going to call prairie resilience. It's a little bit of a license because in my discipline, people usually refer to it by a different word, robustness, but resilience is a little bit more accessible. So thank you so much for coming. And why is my thing not? Oh, okay. There we go. All right, so here's what I'm going to talk about tonight. So I'm going to start by talking about why I love prairies and I'm interested in studying them. And I'm going to move on to why I think pollinators in prairies are really an important thing to study and to understand. Then I'm going to zero in on why looking at the effects of restoration and prescribed fire are interesting and important in the light of what's happening with prairies, and talk about why I think these metrics of resilience are especially interesting. And with that sort of series of introductions, then I'm going to focus in on the results of a 5-year study that we carried out in the South Sound prairies here in Western Washington, looking at the effects of prescribed fire and wildflower replanting on plant pollinator community resilience. So most of the talk will be about that. And then I'll go on to a few other projects at the end, just for fun, to let you all know what other kinds of native plant associated work we're doing. So why prairies? Let's start there. So I'm pretty sure that this audience has a very good idea of why prairies, but let's just talk about them for a minute. Most of you, I'm sure, know that our Puget Trough, Willamette Valley prairies are among the rarest ecosystems in North America. They, as you can see from the map there, they stretch from the south end of the Willamette Valley up through Western Washington, up into British Columbia and Vancouver Island there. They're gorgeous. If you haven't visited them, you should definitely follow up with the hike that Deb mentioned earlier. And because they are rare ecosystems, both historically rare ecosystems and ecosystems that are threatened by all of the biodiversity crisis issues and global climate change issues that we have going on all over the world. For both of those reasons, these prairies host unique and imperiled species. And so here I've just put together a set of charming pictures of some of our charming imperiled species. That's endangered Taylor's checker spot that's landed on a recently delisted golden paintbrush in the left corner, streaked horned lark, the federally endangered Willamette daisy there on the bottom right, and then the Mazama pocket gopher. So all of these are rare and imperiled and important species. But the prairies that they live in, many of the prairies that we have left, of course, have been degraded or changed, altered by land use changes that came in when European colonizing settlers arrived and altered that land use, and also by fire suppression, which was introduced by colonizing settlers, and also by the invasion of non-native plant species. And so now what we have mostly is not so much prairies that look beautiful and diverse and colorful, like the ones in the picture that I showed you earlier, but we have a lot more prairies that look something like this dandelion-like flower. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this plant as something that you hate and trying to get rid of in your lawn. It's in everybody's lawn. It's a Middle Eastern plant called Hypocoris radicata. And you can see that this is a very undiverse looking grassland site. So we have prairies that have been degraded. And at the same time, we have all these restoration projects going on that aim to take lands that look like that one and push them back in the direction of looking more like what we have, our idea of what prairies used to look like, prairies that are dominated by native plants. And there are multiple organizations that do this, and some of the most influential ones, at least that I know of, we have the Institute of Applied Ecology down in the Willamette Valley. We have Eco Studies Institute here in the South Sound, as well as Center for Natural Lands Management. And all of those groups have worked on these kinds of restoration projects. And so in these pictures, you see some of the things that are done to try to get native dominated prairies back. We have people removing invasives in that first picture. We have people collecting native seed from still, tiny, still extant populations of some of these rare plants, and then growing out that seed to either produce more seed or produce seedlings that can then be outplanted in areas. And then in that lower left-hand corner, of course, you see prescribed fire, which historically was a part of these landscapes and plays a very important role in preparing sites for the reestablishment of some of these native plants. So we've got all these, excuse me, we've got all these restoration projects aiming to convert these degraded lands back into prairie. And really, they're really successful. I mean, you go out there and you look, and these sites are just gorgeous where some of this restoration has happened. They look beautiful. You can look at this picture, even if you didn't know what any of the plants were. You can look at this picture, you can see lots of leaf shapes, you can see lots of flower colors, you can see lots of flower architectures. That's the best we can. It's hard to take good pictures of plant diversity, I find, but this one gets kind of close there. But the interesting question to me, and one that has dominated on a lot of my research, is if you build it, will they come? And what I mean by that is, it's one thing to put back all these native plants, but plants are not the only living things that historically occupied this ecosystem, right? Or this community. There's all kinds of other organisms that are also not there in those degraded grasslands. And the question hangs there, where are they? Where are some of these organisms that used to inhabit our prairies? And if we put back native plants, are these other organisms going to materialize? If so, from where? And so that's a question that's really interesting to me. And in particular, the organisms that I'm interested in, whether they materialize or not, are pollinators. like this bee sleeping in a morning glory painted by my friend Mary. Thought it was a great painting. So why pollinators? As I'm sure all of you know, pollination is a mutualism, which is just basically fancy ecologist jargon for a mutually beneficial relationship. And so you have a pollinator that visits a flower, and both of them get something out of the interaction, right? The pollinator gets nutrition, can feed its offspring or itself, and the flower gets to complete sexual reproduction, basically. It gets to spread its gametes to another flower of the same kind so that seed can be produced. So pollination is a mutually beneficial interaction. As such, that in and of itself, I find super interesting. But also, pollination is really important for obvious reasons, because plants have to reproduce, and we have to have our plants reproduce in order to continue having landscapes. There are many plants, as you know, that are wind pollinated or that self-pollinate in various ways. But the best estimates that we have right now is that roughly 85% of land plants depend on a visit from a pollinator, an animal pollinator, often an insect, not always, in our part of the world, often an insect, depend on a visit from an insect to reproduce. And when we go and look at, that's sort of a global number, the 85% number. And when we go and look at both native and exotic wildflowers in our prairies, you can see from those pie charts there, we looked at 52 plants, and we found that, more than 3/4 of both our native and exotic wildflowers require insect pollination. And so what that means is that the landscapes that we care about and that we want to restore, and whose restoration we want to preserve, to continue to exist into perpetuity, right? These landscapes literally can't exist without functioning pollinator communities. And this is why I find pollination so interesting and so important. There's lots of important things, but this is one of them. And so who are these pollinators that are out there? I'm gonna diverge from my main thread just for a minute to give you some beautiful pictures. All of the good pictures in this presentation were not taken by me. They were all taken by a collaborator of mine, the wonderful, inimitable entomologist and photographer, David Kappert. So these are all his pictures. And I'm going to show you a series of I think these are 4 or 5 slides. This is all the pollinator fauna from our prairies, but only on one plant. This is just the pollinators that visit one federally endangered plant, at which we have documented more than 100 taxa. I think it's up to 120 something taxa, species, types of insects. So this is the Willamette daisy. And what you're seeing in this picture is the charming halictid fauna that visits this daisy. So the halictid bees, this is a family of bees. They're colloquially called sweat bees. And here they're clearly just bathing in this pollen. In addition to those bees, here's a set of cuckoo bees, totally different set of critters here. These guys and gals, well, the gals specifically lay their eggs in the nests belonging to other kinds of bees and get those bees to rear their offspring. So they look very different from other bees. So we've got a lot of different kinds of cuckoo bees. A whole bunch of them show up on this one endangered plant from our prairies. Here's a whole other set of bees. That's a longhorn bee in the upper left. There's a Melisodes in the upper right with a giant bunch of pollen on her hind leg. The lower right is a leafcutter bee, and the lower left is a Dialectus. So again, just lots of diversity. And that's before we ever even get to the flies. Here's a tiny fragment of the flies that we find on Willamette daisy. You can see that there's 3 in this picture that are yellow and black, but their patterns are completely different from each other. The first year that we started this project in the South Salish Prairies, we found 21 fly families, and in just one fly family, 19 genera, so 19 genuses, if you're not familiar with that plural genera, and that's before we even get to species. So there's a lot of fly diversity on our prairies. And just for comparison's sake, I work in a lot of, I work on a number of projects now that are not in prairies, and the diversity is nowhere near comparable in the other places where I'm working that are not restored, and are not prairies. So it's been very interesting to see all this diversity. And lastly, of course, we also have Lepidoptera, butterflies and moths. And I'll just point out the character up in the left-hand corner there, which is a moth masquerading as a bee. So we've got a lot of amazing pollinator diversity. And that's why I think both because they're charismatic and beautiful, and also because they're incredibly important to the continuation of our landscapes. That's why pollinators. Now I'm going to turn to some of the actions that we're carrying out on prairies, restoration, prescribed fire in particular. So back to this slide, we've got all these folks who are out there expending a lot of ingenuity and energy to restore these prairies and bring them back to a state that's dominated by native plants. Well, the way I like to think about this is this. So we've got these actions that we call restoration, and I'm going to focus in on prescribed fire and on replanting native wildflowers. Okay, so we carry out the fire, we seed the wildflowers or plant them, and we expect that that's going to do something positive to plant diversity and abundance. And it does. We definitely have found that. There's been some marvelous successes out there. But at the same time, right, these prescribed fires and the planting of seeds affects other things in the system. For example, we might be altering nest sites for pollinators, either positively or negatively. But either way, there's likely some impact, right, on pollinators. And then once those plants and pollinators are both out there, you've kind of shaken up the plant community and you've shaken up the pollinator community, and then they're going to interact with each other as well. There hasn't been a whole lot of research until fairly recently looking at whether, whether these interactions were actually positive. And our work has found that, yes, sure enough, we do actually get back pollinator diversity and abundance when we carry out these restorations. We do get pollinators responding to the increased plant diversity. We do have a positive impact from fire. You can see the plant diversity picture again on the left, and on the right there is just a little example of some of the diversity, just to show you a little rogues gallery of some of the mason bees, native mason bees, mostly native mason bees that we have there. You can see lots of different, if you look carefully at those guys, there's a lot of different faces there. Those are all individual taxa. So we do get back pollinator diversity and abundance. But in some ways, what fascinates me most is the emergent property that you get from all these reshuffled players interacting together and forming a community. You've got reshuffled plants, you've got reshuffled pollinators, and you have a new community with new sets of interactions, new structure, and probably new functions. And one of those many community level functions is the one that I'm going to call resilience. And in this talk, the way I'm going to define that is basically the ability of the community, in this case, the community of plants and pollinators, to remain, to not collapse when something bad happens, when a species is lost, another species is lost from this community. Will it be resilient to that change? That's what I'm interested in. So why resilience? Why should we care? We're restoring these plant pollinator communities. They look really beautiful. Everything's hunky-dory. Pollinators are coming back. They're diverse. So why bother about resilience? Well, we all know for very good reasons that we're going to continue to lose species from these communities. Hopefully, we will also gain species in these communities, but we're certainly going to lose individual species for one reason, because we're trying to, right? There are certain invasive plant species that we're trying very hard to lose. There's a lot of people expending a lot of energy and time to push back against Scotch broom, to push back against, tansy ragwort, or what have you. But we have to remember, right? Pollinators don't see native and exotic. That's a plant that they may be visiting and using. So we're gonna take away a food source. That's gonna reshuffle things, right, in the community. Likewise, for more troubling reasons, we can expect that we're likely to have stochastic losses of rare plants. And stochastic is just a fancy word for random. It just means that when you get a plant, a very small population, right? Just an accident, a freak accident, I don't know, thunderstorm. I can't think of a good example. Hailstorm, say, can cause you to lose a population. So we know that we're going to continue to have these challenges of potentially losing or having strongly diminished populations of some of these species. And so to return back to this picture with all the Hypochorus, okay, there's nothing in this picture for a pollinator to feed on except Hypochorus. And that's why it shows the picture. You can imagine, all of us know that Hypochorus probably isn't going anywhere tomorrow morning, but still, you can, as a thought experiment, you can imagine that if Hypochorus did go somewhere, right, losing just one or a couple plant species from this picture could have a pretty big impact, right? So hence resilience. And so that kind of brings me to, I'm going to talk about the actual study here. And here's the question with which I'm framing this study. So the question is, does restructuring of communities via prescribed fire and replanting native plants, does the restructuring of communities increase or change, I should have said, increase resilience to losing species in the future? In other words, if we change the set of interactions, we change the proportions of who's interacting with who, can that alter how resilient these communities are to losing species in the future? Okay, and so let me go ahead and launch into talking about this. So I'm going to talk about the effects of prescribed fire and wildflower replanting on plant pollinator community resilience. And so here's what we did. We wanted to look at these restoration actions and their effects. So we collected spatially explicit records. Saunders-Fried, thanks to you, that had been kept about the locations and extents of prescribed burns, as well as seeding and plugging of native wildflowers. So we had numbers of species, amount of seed, et cetera. So we had all this information about what had been done restoration-wise at certain sites, okay? And what we did was use those prescribed fire and seeding records to help explain what happened to plants and pollinators. And the way we did that was to look at a gradient of sites. We looked at 6 sites, which we followed for 5 years. I'm only talking about 4 years of data today, but we followed them for 5 years. And the sites at the time that we started this study ranged from the exact one in the picture with all the Hypochorus, very unrestored to very restored. And so we were able to quantify that by means of these records. And at each of these prairies along this gradient of restoration, we collected data on floral composition, what flowers were there, and what pollinators were visiting those flowers. So we did 30 minutes of observation on every flowering species. That adds up. And we identified those pollinators, and we did this 4 times a season. And then we used all that information about the composition of the flowers that were there and all the pollinators and who was visiting which flower to build plant pollinator networks. And I'm going to explain those in the next slide. So we use this data to make a network for every site in every year. And so this is a network. Some of you may have seen this before. And for those of you who haven't, it's cool. So listen up. So on the top, you see the image of the bee there. And you look across the top and you see all those kind of vertical black rectangles. Each of those vertical black rectangles represents a different pollinator species. That's why I put the bee there, to show you that those are pollinators. Then those black rectangles across the bottom of the screen, each of those is a plant species. Okay, if a line connects one to the other, that means we witnessed an interaction between that pollinator and that plant in the field. We watched the pollinator visit that flower. And the thickness of the line is proportional to how often the flower was visited. So this just looks like a bunch of black lines, right? But you can imagine that those black lines could be organized in very different ways. They could all be going straight up and down and never crossing each other, for example. You could have, every plant could just be visited by a single pollinator, or they could be crossing each other a lot. The structure of this network matters to how fragile the network is when you pull a species out of it. And this is what we were using to get at the idea of resilience. Okay, so we've got these plant pollinator networks for each site in each year. And we're asking, first, the first question we asked was, did restoration in the form of prescribed fire and replanting, did restoration restructure these networks? Well, the answer is it did. I'm showing you two sites here. And on the left, these are two networks that represent two different sites in the first year of our study. And for those of you who know these and love these sites, the one on the left is Deschutes, and the one on the right is Tenalquat, I believe. So again, this time across the bottom, the green rectangles, those are all flowers in different flowering species, different wildflowers. And across the top, those are all pollinators. Okay, so you can see there are networks in year one. There's critters there doing their thing, interacting with flowers. And then we have 4 years of restoration. We have 4 years of prescribed fire. We have more or less prescribed fire at some of the sites. Some of them got it a lot. Some of them didn't have so much fire in their history. But you can see, even without knowing anything about how to measure these networks or extract fancy metrics from the networks, you can see visually that there were changes in 4 years. And briefly, those changes increased the size of the networks. In other words, the number of players increased, not just the number of plants, but also the number of pollinators increased as restoration was going on. But it's not just that the number of species increased. There are more interactions. You can see in that lower right-hand corner how all those lines are crossing each other, right? There's more interaction going on. And so these communities of plants and pollinators were reorganized in how they behaved. So the answer is, of course, yes, the restoration restructured the communities. But the really interesting question to me is not, were they restructured? Because that seems kind of obvious that they would be. But the really interesting question is, once they're restructured in this way, does the restructuring of these communities by prescribed fire and replanting alter the resilience of the community to losing species in the future? I hope you're with me. I wish I could check in. If we were in person, I could just like ask, and you'd be looking confused, or you'd be looking thumbs up. But I hope you're all good. Stick with me. This is the fun part. Oh, good. Thank you, Deb. So once we had these networks for every site and every year, blah, 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 what we did was to simulate what would happen if you lose a plant species, right? We obviously don't want to do that in real life. This is a situation where a simulation is a great idea. So here's an example of what we did. And we simulated 6 different ways of losing a plant. Okay, the first 3 ways of losing a plant that we simulated were just controls. So what we did, if you look at this network, again, pollinators across the top, plants across the bottom, and I've shown you a couple of pictures of plants here, we simulated what happens if you pull out the lowest degree plant. That means the plant that has the fewest partners. You can see that plant that says lowest degree, it's only got 1 partner that I've highlighted in red. So you would imagine that if you lose a plant that doesn't interact very much with pollinators, that wouldn't have a big impact, right? By contrast, you might imagine that a plant that interacts with a ton of pollinators, which is called the highest degree plant, so that's the yellow flower there and the red, you might expect that pulling that one out would have a very large impact. a lot of things might lose their partners, things, some kinds of interactions might collapse or go away. And then we also did random removals of plants. So those were our controls. And then we compared those controls to losing plants in ways that are relevant to management and conservation. So in the bottom here, I've made a cartoon field. And in my cartoon field, that yellow flower is the dominant exotic wildflower, an introduced plant. The daisy is the dominant exotic wildflower that also happens to be a noxious weed. And that's our Maria there, the pink one at the bottom there, the rarest native wildflower. So what we did was for every single site in every single year, we decided what's the dominant exotic wildflower at this site, what's the top noxious weed here, and what's the rarest native wildflower at this site. And we did that all through our data. And then we simulated what happens if you remove those. How does that compare to not knowing anything about their a priori about their network positions? What happens if you just remove these plants based on knowing something about their ecology in a different way? And so we did this, we simulated these removals 500 times for each scenario. And here's what we found. What we found was that, I'm going to focus on prescribed fire in particular. What we found was that prescribed fire promoted resilience in every scenario that we looked at. Stick with me while I explain this figure. There's a few different things to explain, but I think you'll get it. So across the bottom, this is this is mislabeled with an old label. This is actually, it says cumulative prescribed fire, and it should actually say pyrodiversity, which is a measure of the diversity of fire history. So I apologize for that mislabeling, but it doesn't matter. It's the same basic idea. So on the x-axis, from left to right, is increasing amount of diversity of fire and fire history. On the y-axis is the amount of secondary extinctions that you get when you lose the plant. So you're pulling out a plant species and you're looking to see how many other species in your community went extinct when you pulled that plant out. Okay, and then the three panels, this is the highest degree plant, this is the random forb in the middle, and the lowest degree plant. And you can see that in every case, as you go from a little fire or not very diverse fire history to a lot of fire or a more diverse fire history, in every case, the number of secondary extinctions goes down. In other words, that means as fire history increases, resilience to losing a plant is going up. In other words, you're losing fewer secondary species. Okay, now let's look at the three panels. So the highest degree plant has the strongest relationship. Sure enough, if a plant's really connected and you pull it out, definitely that has a big impact. But that impact is reduced the more fire history you have. That's interesting. Okay, the random forb is intermediate. And that very poorly connected plant, the lowest degree plant, doesn't matter that much. It doesn't have a big impact when you pull it out. So those are the control scenarios. Now, here's the kicker. Here are the management relevant scenarios. And this is really exciting to me. So the prescribed fire promoted resilience, in other words, reduced secondary extinctions in all of the scenarios where we lost a plant species. But look at what happened with the rare native forb. It looks almost like the highest degree plant. The impact of losing a rare forb is stronger than the impact of losing the exotic plants and even the ones that are designated noxious weeds. And furthermore, the impact of losing the rare forb is strongest when the site has very little history of fire and restoration. So that was actually a really interesting outcome to us. It means that what we think it means is that small patches of rare native forbs are doing something for pollinators that is most special when there aren't a lot of other options around, basically. So the impact of the rare forb is strongest when there's a low history of fire and restoration. And so the take home from this is that rare native forbs can play an outsized role in helping to sustain plant pollinator diversity. And then that's especially true in degraded sites. We entered this project not thinking that that would be true. You know, invasive plants often have a huge display. They're visited a lot by pollinators, but removing them did not make nearly as much difference as we expected. And so we suspect that rare native forbs are actually offering perhaps a different set of nutritional properties. And so when we remove them, we're seeing larger impacts. So it's exciting. And we published this work recently in October 2023 in Ecological Applications. It's open access. Anybody can go click on it and read it for free. So feel free. So our next steps, if we ever get additional funding to carry on this project a little further, we'd like to know why. We'd like to dig deeper into why were rare forbs so important in this situation and find out more about the potential for them offering different functional traits that might help explain this pattern. And then we'd also love to carry it on and ask, how do prescribed fire and wildflower replanting affect resilience to losing pollinators? Because as I'm sure many of you know, lots of our pollinators face challenges as well, perhaps more so than native plants. So that's I'll sum up that project and leave it behind. I'm delighted to take your questions in a few minutes, but before I wrap up entirely, I'll just tell you about a few other projects that we've been working on. We haven't the Prairie project that I just described finished a couple years ago, and so we're doing a lot of work in other kinds of ecosystems and settings. But this first slide actually looks at, we'd like to take the data set that I just talked to you about on the restoration prescribed fire data set and look at how restoration affects the diversity of pollinator traits, the traits that are important in how pollinators are harvesting nutrition from flowers in our prairies. This slide shows you, this is a bunch of tongues from different bee species from our prairies. So we dissected some specimens and we've got measurements of these tongues. These tongues are in proportion to each other. So you can see that they're extraordinarily different between different bee species. You can imagine that giant Bombus californicus tongue that's hooking on the right side of the slide there is probably doing some really different stuff than the inset Spacotes tongue below it. I'd love to know how the diversity of tongue measurements, which is that the tongues are what the pollinators are using to harvest nectar. I'd love to know how that's affected by restoration. So that's a project that we don't have funded, but we do have bunch of pilot data for, and we'd love to go further with that. And then in other realms outside of the prairies, we're looking at whether seed predation is helping to make a wildflower rare, the federally endangered Wenatchee Mountains checker mallow. It has an extraordinary proportion. This is a federally endangered plant. It's got an extraordinary level of seed predation. These checker mallows in general seem to be really susceptible to seed predation, but we're investigating whether there's been the critter that eats it is the weevil on the lower left-hand side. The weevil itself is predated by a tiny little wasp, which is that beautiful green character there. We'd like to know whether there's whether the wasp is perhaps missing or not very abundant in these endangered populations. So that's another project. We are looking at how a newly arriving invasive bumblebee affects native bumblebee species. These are all with many collaborators across different localities and institutions. We're studying the effect of invasive cheatgrass on a rare wildflower on the east side, much more arid environment. We're looking, this is a collaboration with Eco Studies folks. We're looking at whether conservation grazing can help restore native prairie on working lands and also be economic for ranchers. We have a little project looking at how pollinator communities differ between mainland and island prairie restorations. So that's cool. This is out on the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And lastly, we're working to provide illustrations and potentially even make new working keys for helping identify common Pacific Northwest bees for which there are no working keys. And this work is mostly done by our collaborator, David Kappert. And so with that, I will wrap up and thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate everybody coming. I want to thank my funding sources, in particular, Jim and Birta Falconer, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Department of Defense for the Johnson Prairie work, and acknowledge the support of the Center for Natural Lands Management, particularly in the person of Saunders Freed, and as well as the Institute for Applied Ecology, which has done a lot of work with me down in the Willamette Valley Prairies. And many thanks to my field and lab team, my taxonomy team, and my co-authors on this particular project. And we love to meet other people who like to do this stuff. So please feel free to get in touch. And I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, wow. Thank you, Susan. That was fascinating. Really, really love your work. So yeah, please, folks, put your questions in the chat. And let me just see, we have some here, and I can start with those. I want to make sure I'm finding the most. Yeah, we have a lot of comments. Okay.
Good.
Oh, good, good. So here's cheering in the background. Love the graph type. Just beautiful.
Oh, good. Thank you.
People love the network charts. They're amazing. Which it just gives so much information is condensed in something like that. They're really great. Okay.
I love to use it for that reason. I mean, I feel like I certainly didn't originate that usage. They're widely used in the field that I work in. But I love them because they're very approachable, whether you're going to do fancy algorithms with them or not. They have a sort of intuitive, people intuitively respond to them, I think. So
yeah. Okay, so Megan Howard asks, can you expand a little on pyrodiversity? Does that frequency and intensity?
Hang on one second. Let me see if what happened? I am, unfortunately, I left out the slide that explains pyrodiversity. No, so pyrodiversity is a really useful metric. In fact, it was promulgated, I think in part developed and at least minimally promulgated by Lauren Panicio at the University of Oregon. And it's a metric where you look, you look at the, so what we did, I wonder if I could find the slide on short notice. What we did was to look, so we had an area of study, right? And our area of study, I'm making a circle with my hands to show the area of study. Our area of study might be overlapped by a whole series of different burns, right? You know, this bottom half maybe was burned 10 years ago, and this side maybe was burned 2 years ago. And that already gives you 4 different burn histories, right? If this down here was burned 10 years ago, and this right here was burned 2 years ago, you have 4 different quarters of the circle, and each of them has a different history, a different burn history, because of the way that the burns have overlapped and not overlapped. And so pyrodiversity is a way of tallying up those burn histories using basically the Shannon-Weiner diversity index that's used in ecology. So it's literally producing a diversity measure for burn histories. And so that's actually what we used. And I apologize for the mislabeling of the cumulative fire. It was actually pyrodiversity.
Okay, great. Let's see. So Josh Seacats, and I apologize to people when I slaughter your names. Okay. Asks, do secondary extinctions just look at other plant species or both pollinator and plant species? So when
Good
you're talking
question.
about
Yeah, great question. So the secondary extinctions that we tracked, so we were only simulating the loss of plant species, but we were following, that loss reverberates through the network, right? And so what we're following actually in a probabilistic way is all of the other extinctions that would follow on as a result. And you can imagine that depending on how the network is connected, you might have the same players, but if you have a highly connected network, that one loss would propagate in a different way than if you have a lightly connected network. Or if I don't know if you can picture that difference, but yes. So when we simulated losing a plant species, we then followed all of the secondary extinctions of both plant and pollinator species in response.
Ashley Arthur says validation. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Mary Linders comments, these results are super important in light of Thurston County's HCP, Habitat Conservation Plan, and the identification of even degraded remnant prairies.
That's an excellent point, Mary. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, Zach Peterson asks, can you speak to how pollinator species who are absent at unrestored prairies repopulate after restoration prescribed fires?
Right. That is such an excellent question. And boy, do I wish I knew. To be honest, I don't. I really, in my mind, when we started this project, it was absolutely not a foregone conclusion that plant restoration would result in increased pollinator diversity. I actually was pretty skeptical about that because these are small sites. These are dinky little prairies in a sea of not prairie, in a sea of degraded stuff, right? Or forest, but there's a lot of development. And I don't know what to think about that. I am fairly surprised that these tiny prairies and all the restoration work that's been carried out, I don't know where these pollinators are coming from. I don't know if they've been around all the time at very low levels. Are they subsisting somewhere else? I mean, I just don't know. But here's a comparison. So that this 4 to 5 year study, for the 4 years that I was talking about here, we saw at South Sound Prairie sites in these 4 years, I think I'm right in saying that we got 42 species of digger bees, 40, or maybe it was 46. It was a lot. It was a lot of species. That's one genus of bee, Andrena. So 40, 42, 46, something like that. I'm working currently on a sampling in a very similar way on a project up in Whatcom County, which is mostly at, it's in city parks and more degraded sites, Department of Transportation sites. We have 3 species of Andrena after 3 years of sampling. Sorry, 2 years of sampling. But I don't know where all those Andrena are. Have they been in the prairies the whole time and they just show up and get happy when we have a lot more wildflowers, or are they subsisting on forest edge? I have no idea. I'd love to know. It's a really important question. Yeah, thank you for posing it, and I'm sorry I don't have an answer.
Great. Okay. Sarah Kellington has posted the link to your journal article in the chat.
Oh, thank you.
So people can find that there. So Kurt Reidinger asks 2 questions. Does anyone know if wildflowers are susceptible to attack by fungal pathogens? And a follow-up question, could introduction of a fungal pathogen be an example of a stochastic event?
Well, I don't know very much. Oh, did someone say something?
No, go ahead.
Oh, I heard. I don't know very much about fungal pathogens, but I know that certainly wildflowers can be affected by fungal pathogens, and sometimes they're vectored by pollinators. And sure, any disease could be considered a stochastic event. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. Great information, remarkable body of work. Thank you for a wonderful talk. Looking forward to the 15th. Can you say about how strongly praying mantis might be impacting pollinators?
Oh, no,
We find a lot of those
that's
out on the prairie.
yeah, that's a really interesting question that I also don't know the answer to. I suspect I don't think a ton just because of timing. You know, when I see mantises, it's usually getting kind of later into the summer, and a lot of pollinators are, you know, quite a few of them are sort of finishing up in the prairies by the time the mantises come out. But I'm sure, yeah, I don't know any more beyond that. I feel like phenologically that there's not that it probably isn't a huge impact, but I don't know that much about mantises. There could be some impact.
Okay, great. Saunders Freed asks, can we follow up surveys in the future as restoration proceeds and meets habitat goals? He
Saunders,
says he can find the money.
Saunders, I will come back and do this and read anytime. I miss doing it so much. You just find some money for me. I'll do it.
All right. Kate Gerndt, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that, already sent your article to my friend who's a botanist for Maine and studied plants. He loves it.
Great. Thank
Okay. Can you speak to floral visitation versus pollination? And I also wonder why some visitors go to flowers. Do we know much about nutritional reasons for visitation? And how do you figure out who actually pollinates some of these plants?
Yeah, those are all excellent questions. So visitation versus pollination. So all of our data are visitation data, not actual pollination data. So what we did was stand in front of flowers, wait, for 30 minutes at a time and wait for something to come by and land on the flower and contact either the stigma or the stamens of the flower. And how we defined a visit. Okay. And if the insect contacted those reproductive parts of the flower, then we netted the insect and captured it. So that's a visit. We don't know if it's a pollination event, right? Because for it to be a pollination event, the incoming insect has to be carrying pollen, and not just any pollen, but pollen belonging to that same plant species. And that pollen has to be transferred from the body of the insect to the female receptive part of the plant, the stigma. And then that pollen has to grow a pollen tube and actually, fertilize the eggs in the ovary. And so there's a lot of events that have to happen. We were only looking at visitation. So if there's some, you can imagine there's some logistical challenges to trying to actually make a network of actual pollination events. Yeah. Did I answer the question? Yeah.
There's also, this is from Elaine Stewart, who says hello.
Hey, Elaine.
And do we know much about nutritional reasons for visits?
Oh, yeah.
That was
Okay.
part of her question.
Great question also. So nutritional reasons for visits. So flowers where we live usually offer at least one of two possible resources, nutritional resources, either pollen or nectar, or both. Usually there's not that much that just offers nectar, right? But so pollen is protein-rich food that is collected by adult bees to provision young bees. usually their own young, if it's a solitary bee, or perhaps a sister, if it's a social bee. But it's like, you can think of it in the same way as well, I want to say breast milk, something that's really high in protein, right? Something that's high in protein that's meant to provision a juvenile. Nectar is high in sugars, and it is meant to provision adults. It's used to provision adults usually, although it might also be brought back to be, to be part of honey, things like that, if you're talking about honeybees. But usually, so there's pollen that's protein rich, and there's nectar that's carbohydrate rich.
Okay, great, thank you. Kathleen Lewis asks, Susan, thank you. Would you expect the same results with pollinator diversity and resilience with other restoration techniques other than fire replanting, like mechanical replanting, herbicide replanting, etc.?
Right. Good question. And that gets to the point that I skimmed over some of the details of this study, right? Like it's not a direct line from like fire to bees, right? There's fire, then you have plant abundance gets changed, diversity gets changed, and and all there's a lot of pieces here. I would expect that any restoration approach that is increasing floral diversity is likely to also increase pollinator diversity. But we did find that there was not only a positive effect of increasing the plant diversity, but that the burn itself had a positive effect over and above that, separatable from its effect on increasing plant diversity. We don't know why that is. We're not sure if it makes, a lot of our bees are ground nesting bees. It's possible that we're making, prescribed fires on our prairies burn away thatch. They can, depending on how hot they are, they can be burning away moss, or it's possible they're making some kinds of nesting sites more available. That's one possibility. But I think that I would expect that anything that's increasing floral abundance and diversity would be likely to have positive impacts on pollinator diversity, always assuming they can materialize out of nowhere, as they seem to be.
Okay, great. So Elaine Stewart again says, I'm involved in local backyard habitat programs in the Portland area and wonder what potential you think these have. If we bring back native plants to urban landscapes, do you think pollinators will respond? Do you think they can advance pollinator conservation on the landscape?
Well, yes, I do. I think they're worthwhile. I work, one of the projects I did not profile is a corporate rooftop project that I work on in the city of Seattle, which is, there's so little habitat that the habitat on this rooftop is probably the best habitat for, a radius of a mile around. And we're finding very slowly that pollinators are showing up there. I do think that a lot depends on the sort of the landscape scale availability of flowers already, right? Flowers and nesting sites, both are important. Mm-hmm. But, if there's a lot of backyard habitat already, then adding more might not be that influential. But there's an awful lot of areas in cities where there's not a lot of backyard habitat, or where there's parks that are just, turf grass and non-flowering shrubs, or shrubs that flower for 2 weeks in April and then nothing else for the rest of the year. So those are localities where, yes, I definitely think that adding, if that's what you live near, or if that's what's around you, I do think that adding backyard habitat probably has quite a positive impact. I don't think it's ever a bad thing.
Great. Samantha Martin says, great talk, Susan, thank you. Did you separate out perennials and annuals in looking at plant pollinator partnerships with the varying degrees of fire history? Does
No,
fire increase resilience by creating conditions for annuals to regenerate and thus increasing overall diversity?
yeah, that's also a great question. Excellent question. No, and we actually, again, this is a situation where I sort of was glossing over some of the details, but we did look at both short-term impacts of fire. So we had a variable that was like, the amount of fire within the past 2 years. And then we also had pyrodiversity, which was an integrated measure of fire history over the previous 10 years. That short-term metric, which would have reflected the annuals, had no effect. So it's not just a matter of annuals.
It's really interesting. Okay. Josh S. says, thanks so much. Looking forward to reading the paper. Regina says, pretty much anything can be attacked by fungus. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Kate says, I've been noticing what seems to be a lot of bees with unusually small wings, sometimes with mites on them. They are all in the process of dying when I find them. Should I do anything with these? Would anyone like these reported?
I wonder if honeybees or bumblebees or solitary bees. I'm guessing you might be talking about honeybees or bumblebees. I don't know of a program to which you would report that. But it's definitely interesting.
Yeah, let's see, there's one new message. It was fuzzy and bumble looking, but tiny, she says.
Interesting. I'd be very interested to know if it was a bumblebee. Yeah, drop me a note and we'll talk.
Okay, great. Chris Newmiller says, so good news for our own native gardens. Make them more diverse, attract more species, something we can all participate in. Agreed. And you can get more species at the native plant sale on April 20th.
Indeed.
Or any of the WNPS native plant sales. Okay. Melissa Rowe Skoll says, brilliant, inspiring talk. Thank you. I look forward to sharing webinar with restoration apprentices, interns, etc. So mentees. So yes, we will post that later this week. Okay. Tefton Richard says, whenever one plant species is lost, space is freed up for other species. For example, if cat's ear were lost, shooting stars might increase. Did your modeling exercise count for all of that?
Our model, so that's also a good question. So at that site that I showed you, though, there isn't any shooting star, or at least there wasn't any then. But it has to be there at least in small numbers in order to take that space when the space is freed up, right? But that's a really good point. So no, the simulate, this is there's a lot of ways that you can imagine things going differently than in this simulation. This is I see the simulation as a way to, it's a way to get a sense of which questions to ask next in the field, basically, right? But it gives us a pretty good hypothesis to work with. In terms of the modeling, no, we didn't include plant competition in that model. And that would be a fascinating thing to do. In order to do that, we would need a lot more information on plant competition for every plant in those networks. And that would be a cool thing to do, but we didn't do that. I'd love to.
That would be cool. Okay, Christina Prosser says, thank you for your presentation. Much gratitude. Really insightful and hopeful that we are not doing unintended harm to pollinators in our restoration efforts. So I think this is good news for people doing restoration. Samantha Martin says, what are some of the most visited native wildflowers?
Well, there are There's a lot of them. I would say, so I guess what I feel about that question is, I told you that Willamette daisy, we've seen, over 100 taxa of pollinators visiting, but we also, that wasn't part of the project that I profiled here. That was because that plant is not in the South Sound. What we are finding more and more as we work on rare wildflowers across the state, when we have funding to spend a lot of time capturing pollinators that visit a flower, boy, the more you look, the more you find. There's a lot of plants out there that get lots of different visitors. I would say in our network study, we were spending a limited amount of time on every single flower, or every single species. So I think that if we had spent more time, we would see more. However, having said that, some things that I had high visitation. Okay, so Potentilla gracilis, slender cinquefoil, that was one. All of the lupins get visits from osmias, which are mason bees, as well as bumblebees. They don't have the high diversity in the same way, but they're provisioning a different set of insects. Likewise, Micranthes and Tigrifolia is provisioning kind of a different set of insects. It tends to provision beetles. And that's kind of cool because a lot of others are not doing that. Oh gosh, there's so many. There's a few to get you started. Oh, Camas has like 45 visitors or something, even when we didn't spend the same kind of time on it as we did in the focal studies. So yeah, everything visits Camas.
So Kate again mentions 2017 or 16, I found out through University of Minnesota that pollinators feeding off of roadside prairie habitat upper Midwest were detrimentally affected due to the increased levels of heavy metals and toxins from road emissions. Could we be hurting pollinators by using some remnant scraps of prairie in urban areas? And in Wisconsin, Minnesota, we burn side of highways to intentionally increase pollinator habitat, which helps clear up sides of roads.
I mean, nobody, in places that are polluted in any way, the pollinators are not going to stop visiting, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't create habitat. I feel like, I don't think that, maybe we don't want to go and deliberately create habitat in areas that are known to have heavy metal toxin. But I guess I feel like the overall, unless you're going to look on a case-by-case basis, I feel like in general, habitat is a big deal, big issue for pollinators. And I think that working to create habitat is usually a pretty good thing to do. Well, of course, using our sense about maybe not doing it where things are toxic. But I would also say, this is a good moment to bring this up. Usually when people are talking about a pollinator habitat, what comes to mind is flowers and floral resources, which is excellent. However, nesting resources for pollinators are equally and sometimes more important. And that's not the topic of this talk, but that's something to look up if you're thinking about creating backyard habitat. We have a lot of ground nesting insects. Some of them like really hard packed ground, some of them like pre-existing holes made by rodents. There's all kinds of diverse ways of allowing crevices to be in your lawn and not covering everything with bark mulch. Bark mulch is really bad for ground nesting insects.
Okay. So I think we're getting close to the end. Okay, so Tevin Richards asks, to what degree do late blooming like goldenrod and aster curtis have outsized benefits?
Late blooming species, that's an excellent question. Late blooming species can have really important benefits because there's not a lot out there on the prairie in the late season. Aster curtis, however, I've really never seen much of a pollinator community visiting Aster curtis. I think it may be selfing, but I don't know for sure. We didn't have populations of Aster curtis at our sites we only had it at one of the sites, and the population wasn't big enough. The patch was not big enough to qualify for watching. We need to have a threshold flower patch size, otherwise pollinators won't show up. So we kind of set a threshold, and it didn't meet the threshold. So we didn't watch Aster curtis. Goldenrod, on the other hand, is really important to lots of insects, for sure.
Okay, I think that's the I think that's the end. So,
well, thank you so much.
Okay, well, we just got a bunch more. Okay, Douglas aster is a good one, a good late season plant from Regina. Saunders says the support your studies lend to restoration is really valuable, and I will be citing you regularly.
Awesome.
Many thanks from lots of folks. So
thank you all so much for spending so much time and hanging out online and on an evening. You could have been watching TV, but thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to all of you who organized this, and thanks to Deb and others, Regina and others who have put time and effort into this. I really appreciate being invited.
Well, we're so pleased to have you. Thank you so much for doing a talk for us, even though you're doing one next week. And I think you've just piqued everybody's interest in the one next week. Yeah, I know I'm not going to miss it. So we really appreciate you being here, Susan. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm glad it worked out. I'm glad we were already planning Zoom when the on-site meeting fell apart. So I'm feeling like that worked pretty well. So, and we're getting lots more comments. What I'll do is I'm going to grab a copy of the comments and I'll send it to you so you can
great.
see. And,
yeah, thank you very much.
Get back with people.
Super.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everyone for being here. Thanks for participating in the webinar, and yeah, thank you again, Susan. So, and we'd all be clapping, yay, if this was in person, but really great talk. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Bye.